Welcome to the WebMD Health Discovered podcast. I'm Dr. Neha Pathak, WebMD's Chief Physician Editor for Health and Lifestyle Medicine. Today, we'll dive into an issue that is one of the most common gastrointestinal complaints that physicians see in their offices: constipation. About 4 million people in the US have frequent constipation, resulting in 2.5 million doctor visits every year. We'll discuss what exactly constitutes having constipation, home remedies, their effectiveness, and when to see your doctor. Plus, we'll share some practical lifestyle changes for better gut health. Here to walk us through this topic is our guest, Dr. Will Bulsiewicz. Dr. Bulsiewicz, better known as Dr. B, is a gastroenterologist and New York Times best-selling author known for his exploration of the relationship between the gut microbiome and plant-based nutrition. Welcome to the WebMD Health Discovered podcast, Dr. B.
Dr. Pathak, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So before we jump into our topic for today, I'd love to just ask about your own personal health discovery. What was your aha moment around the work you do with the microbiome, plant-forward diets? How did you get interested in this?
Well, this was not a normal part of my mission to be a doctor who helps people. And I chose gastroenterology prior to the discovery or the new science of the microbiome that has been enabled by new laboratory techniques that we have developed just in the last 18 years or so. For me, it really started with my own moment of illness and needing help. I was in my early 30s. I was finishing up my training in my gastroenterology fellowship, and I was about 50 pounds overweight compared to what I weighed in high school. And I had health issues: high blood pressure, high cholesterol, trouble digesting my food, lots of food intolerances, low self-esteem. Despite all the great things that were happening in my career, I still didn't feel good about myself. And I was actually quite anxious and depressed. The bottom line is that in that moment where I needed help, I actually didn't want the medicine that I had been trained to prescribe myself. I preferred a more holistic solution, something that would actually address the root of my issues. I didn't think that the source of my problems was the absence of a blood pressure pill or the absence of a statin. Not to say that there's not a place for those things. They're very important. But the bottom line is that in that moment, I needed something different. And it was the discovery that I could heal myself through nutrition that motivated me to learn more about this space and then to bring it to my patients.
I'm also very interested and passionate about lifestyle medicine, which is an emerging field that kind of pulls all of those pillars that you highlighted together. And like you said, not as a replacement for, but really as a foundation on which to build health. And then if other tools are necessary, medicines, etc., of course, as physicians, we'll definitely use those tools in our toolkit. I think that we both agree on that. But that there is a major role for thinking about the foods that we're eating, our physical activity, our stress management, sleep, as playing a major role in our health and kind of getting at the root of a lot of health conditions, not just one condition at a time.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said. For me, this is about results. As physicians, we are here to deliver results and elevate the health of our patients. And if we are ignoring something that is contributing to the root of the problem, then we're not doing good care from a medical perspective. We may be able to cover it up with pills and procedures. There is certainly a place. And I have, trust me, prescribed thousands of proton pump inhibitors during my career, even if I may be critical of the safety profile of them when they're not necessary or being used chronically. So the bottom line is, from my perspective, I believe there's a place for all of these things: diet, lifestyle, medications, procedures, even supplements. I think there's a place for all of it.
Well, so then let's dig in to how we can think about constipation, because as a primary care doctor, I know that is a concern that many of my patients come in with. How should we think about defining what constipation is?
Well, traditionally, there's been a fixation on frequency. How often does a person have a bowel movement? And we see this not only among our patients, but we even see this among many healthcare providers, where they think that it's just, hey, if you fit within these criteria, then you are or you are not constipated. The numbers that are used are typically on the order of 3 bowel movements per week. So if you're having less than 3 bowel movements per week, then that would qualify as constipation. You have one bad week, this doesn't make you chronically constipated. It has to be more of an ongoing issue than that. But what I would really like to bring attention to are all of the other people who are constipated. Because I think that there's a huge number of people, many of whom, like, there's going to be people who are listening to us literally right now, that this will apply to them and a light bulb will go off and they'll realize, wow, maybe I'm actually constipated, even though I poop every single day. So there are people who are constipated that have other issues. It could be difficulty with defecation because the stool is very hard, requiring them to strain. It could be incomplete bowel movements, incomplete evacuation, where they go, but they don't actually fully empty. So they still need to go. Or it could be people who are just having trouble getting that bowel movement to come out. And there's a number of different sort of pelvic floor or muscular type issues that can contribute to that. But I think that the take home message for all of our listeners is that it's not just how often you poop. You could poop every single day and you could be constipated, and creating solutions to these issues is how we get people better.
So I think that's a really interesting and important point. How would you know if we're not thinking about something that you could easily track, like, okay, do I have 3 bowel movements a week? If you are going every single day or there's some other cause for constipation, how would one sort of recognize that this may be a problem for them? What are some of those symptoms?
All right, so it's a bit of a nuanced answer, but where I want to start is with bloating. Because almost every single person who is chronically constipated is suffering with chronic bloating. And the bloating is proportional to the constipation. And when you relieve the constipation, meaning that you help them to improve the fullness, the completeness of their evacuations, where they are adequately emptying, and you take them to that place, it's amazing how the bloating goes away. It's like a magical thing. Now, there are a number of different symptoms also that could be attributed beyond bloating, that could be attributed to constipation. And it could be hard stool, changes in the stool, lumpy, bumpy stools. Beyond the stool, you could have discomfort. It could be a dull discomfort. It could be discomfort that radiates to your back. It could also be sharp discomfort that comes in waves, gets progressively more intense, and then relieves itself for a quick moment before it builds back up with a second wave. I've had patients where the discomfort that they have is so intense that they go to the emergency room thinking that they actually need to see a surgeon. And when the answer is no, we just need to empty your colon, it seems a little bit silly to them. But then when we actually do it, they feel better. Constipation is often associated with nausea. It may not be nausea like, hey, I'm actually going to throw up. It may just be a sense of queasiness, like you just aren't really hungry. You don't feel very well. You have a little bit of an upset stomach. It can also be associated with like lower energy levels. So I'm quite shocked by how often that happens. And then the last thing is that constipation causes food intolerances. You may start feeling like you can't process and digest your food, and there may not be a clear pattern to this. It may not be one specific food. It may be almost everything. You may drink water and feel like that causes you to get bloated. And in that setting, it's constipation. If you were to take that person, relieve the constipation, get them more regular, get them more complete in their evacuations, then actually those food intolerances, they magically wash away. What I want people to hear is if you're hearing a couple of these different symptoms that you personally are experiencing, then the question needs to become, could this be constipation? And there are a number of ways to answer that. But sometimes what I will do is just get a basic x-ray. And the x-ray tells the story. It's objective. There's just no denying it.
So, one, you kind of laid out a couple of symptoms. So, you're thinking if this seems like a picture that is similar to the picture that you're living, so multiple of these symptoms, and they've sort of been going on over time, first ask yourself, could this be constipation? And then a step by step approach to sort of trying to sort that out. Maybe if you're having a hard time getting an appointment or before you can potentially even get in to see a gastroenterologist or your primary care, what are some things that people might start thinking about doing at home to see if this might be relieving potential constipation, might make them feel better?
Yeah, these things can be a bit complicated. From my perspective as a gastroenterologist, having chronic pain or having a change in your bowel habits, these are reasons that I would want you to come to see a gastroenterologist so you could talk through in more details. So I'm not here to advocate for a home diagnosis based upon a podcast or a home remedy. But that being said, the solution to this idea is actually rather simple, which is that if you can enhance the ability to empty your colon, if you can get things moving more efficiently, more routinely, and you experience the relief from these symptoms, that's a highly compelling argument that this was just that you were backed up in a way.
We know in general there are healthy behaviors that can optimize your health, regardless of whether or not you have a diagnosis of constipation or other chronic health condition. What are some of those pretty safe, basic things that someone might want to think about in terms of changing their diet, for example?
I tend to think about constipation in terms of mild, moderate, and severe. These are just my own sort of classifications. There's not some formal rule of how we apply this. And in my career, I never really got to see the people with mild constipation unless they were just confused about what was going on and didn't know that this was, in fact, the issue. And that's because mild constipation is actually highly amenable to these diet and lifestyle strategies. And you can implement them, and you might experience substantial relief from your symptoms to the point that you don't feel that you need to go see a doctor anymore. So, these things can be an increase in fiber intake. From my perspective, dietary fiber, we start with our diet. We try to increase the fiber through fruits, vegetables, whole grains, seeds, nuts, and legumes, all the plant based foods. There is a place for fiber supplements, and I've had tremendous success using fiber supplements in addition to diet to address these types of issues. So, we increase our fiber intake. When we increase our fiber intake, we want to float the log down the river, Neha. And in order to float the log down the river, a dry river, we want a nice river that it has plenty of water to carry things downstream. So it's important to increase our hydration, particularly if we're increasing our fiber intake. Part of what makes fiber effective is the fact that it is basically binding water, holding onto water, and lubricating those bowel movements and sweeping them down. So we should increase our water intake. And the last thing is that when you move, it helps your intestines to move. The most obvious example of this is that among serious endurance runners, people who are running marathons, there's something called the runner's trots. They go out for a run and then they have to poop. And this concept can be applied to anyone. And you don't have to make yourself into a marathon runner. Even just simply walking around your neighborhood can be quite helpful. So if you do these things, increase your fiber intake, increase your hydration, and you get some exercise, get out and move, you may find that this by itself really helps you with this issue. If that's the case, you probably had mild constipation. Moderate or severe constipation, it's a little bit of a different story.
My question is then around the goalpost. So, how much fiber are we recommending? What's your goal so that someone might have a starting point to get to? So, they may not start with that straight away, but they might say, okay, eventually I'm going to work myself up to this amount of fiber.
As we sit here, 95% of Americans are deficient in fiber. And it's not a mild deficiency, it's actually profoundly deficient in fiber. So the average woman in the United States is 10 grams per day below the goal. And the average man in the United States is 20 grams per day below the goal. What are these numbers? For women, it's 25 grams per day. For men, it's 38 grams per day. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that if you have constipation, coming back to constipation, that you should take your diet and instantly jump up to these numbers. That would actually be a mistake. So when we approach fiber is to slowly increase. And so I have this phrase that I like, which is low and slow is the tempo. By the way, this was a Beastie Boys song back in the 80s, but nonetheless, I'm dating myself with that. But low and slow is the tempo because our body needs an opportunity to adapt and adjust to higher fiber intake. It can be disruptive and jarring to go too far with the fiber. In fact, to go too far with the fiber might actually make your constipation worse. So this is why we want to ease our body into this. So it really is dependent on the individual person. If you're consuming 0 grams of fiber per day, which by the way, there are people right now who are doing that, you don't want to jump to 25. You will be miserable. You should probably go 3 to 8, somewhere in that range. And then in a couple of weeks, you can go up a little bit higher. And the same is true for all of us. There may be some people who have a normal amount of fiber intake. They've actually met those goals, but actually a little bit more may help them to poop more regularly. So just because you met that number doesn't mean that the work is done.
So that's where you might be thinking hydration or potentially increasing a little bit more fiber, moving more as adjuncts to your fiber.
100%. And I also think that we have to be careful because fiber has been painted as the silver bullet, the solution to all of our constipation problems. It is a definite part of the solution. And considering that we live in a world where 95% of us are deficient, yes, we should address that. And by the way, the benefits are far reaching way beyond constipation. That being said, I don't want people to be disappointed if they increase their fiber intake and it doesn't fix all of their issues. And sometimes people increase their fiber intake and they still need something in addition to that. So this is not by itself. For people who have mild constipation, probably enough. If you have moderate or severe constipation, probably not going to be enough. We probably need more than that.
So, talk about then what is the more than that? So, tell me a little bit about when you said supplements you found to be really helpful. And then when someone gets to needing you, a gastroenterologist, for their constipation, what are you thinking in terms of your stepwise approach?
Okay, so I have a sort of basic cocktail. We'll call it a cocktail, which is a combination of things that I like to begin with for the treatment of constipation. Now, before I even say this, let me just point out that this is not what I do for every single person who has constipation. We have to personalize this, but I'll just share sort of the way that I often will approach this, which is that I like to combine a fiber supplement, of course, a high fiber diet, but a fiber supplement, which can give us an immediate boost and it's a targeted boost. Put that in combination with either magnesium supplements or Miralax. Now, with magnesium, we have to be a little bit careful. Number one, we need to make sure this is appropriate for the individual patient. So the nice thing is we can check magnesium levels, we can check kidney function, and know that in fact this is okay. But the other thing is that there's many forms of magnesium, and many of the popular ones aren't that helpful for constipation. And so you might say, Dr. B, I heard you say on the podcast magnesium, and I did it and it didn't help. We have to make sure that it's one of these three types: magnesium oxide, magnesium citrate, or magnesium sulfate. What makes them unique is that they're not absorbed very easily. So what happens is that when you take the right amount, it actually starts to pull water into the colon. So when you combine this water intake that's coming into the colon with a fiber supplement, you are basically creating this sort of synergistic effect that can really help to mobilize our bowel movements. And that's exactly the way that Miralax works as well. Miralax is a medication, and I've used it many times throughout my career. So I don't just do magnesium. I talk to my patient and see what they would prefer. So this combination could be a great place to start. There's, by the way, much stronger medications than this. They're by prescription only. They are highly effective. We also need to make sure that they're the right choice, because there's a myth around constipation that I would like to bust right now if I could, which is that constipation is just slow intestines, sluggish intestines. That can be true, but it's not always true. And there has been a change in the last 15 years, specifically within my field, that many physicians even may not be even aware that this happened or this exists. I would break constipation into two main types. One is the transit, the way in which the intestines are moving. So that would be slow transit. So these things that I've been talking about, they work for that. But the second is what I would describe as outlet dysfunction. And that the problem is not the motility or the movement of your intestines. The problem is that the bottom is not opening up to relax. And this is more common among women. It can happen at all stages of life. So it can happen during pregnancy years or 20, 30 years later. And the treatment for this, when present, is not medication. The treatment for this is actually physical therapy, because the pelvic floor is not working the way that it's supposed to. And much like if I hurt my shoulder, I could mask the pain with a pill, but I can't actually restore function to the shoulder with a pill. I have to work it with a therapist. The same is true of our bottom. If our bottom is not functioning the way that it's supposed to, the way that we restore function is with a therapist. So I want people to hear and understand this, because also there are people who have tried every medication. And if you have tried every medication without success, but you haven't been tested for these pelvic floor issues, that's where you need to go next.
It's so important to talk again and reiterate your earlier point, highlight it and underline it, which is that this is something that you do want to think about doing in conjunction with the healthcare professional. So I think sometimes we just hear the term or we think, okay, I'm just constipated. And so we are going to that over the counter aisle and potentially buying all of these supplements and different vitamins, et cetera, and doing a lot of things and maybe not necessarily finding the benefit and thinking, oh, well, maybe I just need more, or maybe I need something different. So it's really helpful to go through this in a step-by-step way with a health professional that can escalate and do various different types of tests to help differentiate what may be going on and help you optimize what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, and I think that getting the proper diagnosis is an important part of this process, because the constipation may not be the diagnosis. It may be the symptom being driven by something else. And examples of this, where it's very important to get the proper diagnosis, could be that if there's something going on in the rectum, so for example, could be a polyp or even cancer. You want to find that, and not to be scary, but you want to know and find that as early as possible. Because if you do, then actually you're going to be in a great spot. What you don't want is to miss it, miss the opportunity, and find it later on. So when there's a change in bowel habits, there's an argument to do colonoscopy. For some people, that is life-saving, but also more benign things that aren't, like, I don't mean to be scary, but more benign things that aren't as scary. So like an example would be an anal fissure. So an anal fissure can cause people to get super constipated. And the solution to this issue is to actually treat the anal fissure. By the way, for those who are wondering, anal fissure, what that is involving the bottom. So involving the anus or the anal muscle, there's actually a tear, and that tear causes discomfort, bleeding, and it can actually really cause that muscle to clamp down and not relax. And as a result of that, people just can't go. And if you treat the fissure, they get better and they start pooping again.
Thank you for highlighting that point.
We could do an entire podcast on the topic. But if we were to distill this down, so first of all, the microbiome, just in short, I'm sure many people have already heard at least something about this, but living on us and also inside of us is an entire ecosystem of living microorganisms, and they actually outnumber us. There's 38 trillion bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms that live inside of our large intestine. And that is more than the number of cells that we have in our body. When people talk about gut health and the microbiome, the new science is our discovery of how connected this is to so many facets of human health. And where it comes in with constipation has to do in part with our rhythm. And these microbes do play a role in our bowel motility, the way that our intestines move. And many of the studies as they exist currently right now, Neha, are association studies. So we can't define with absolute clarity what causes what. In other words, is the slow transit causing a change in the microbiome, or is it the other way around? But what we do know is this, that fiber, particularly soluble fiber, works in part because it changes the microbiome. And probiotics, which by the way are not my first line treatment, but I'm just sharing this as proof of concept that there are probiotics that clearly in randomized controlled trials have shown that you can improve constipation. And so these things would suggest that these microbes are playing a really important role. And here we are. And again, like the most important thing for our microbiome is actually to feed them. And the food that they prefer is fiber. This is the food that our microbes prefer and love the most. And here we are, 95% of Americans are fiber deficient. And if we just simply address this one issue, we would go so far in terms of improving human health because we'd be supporting our gut microbes much better.
I think that you're right. We can do an entire podcast episode on this, but yeah, I love it when solutions are multi-solving in many ways. So I think that, certainly as a primary care doc, that is something that I love is when we can get, as you said earlier, to root causes, something that's beneficial for your own personal health, something that's beneficial for all of these beings that are living on you and in you, that we have this relationship together that impacts not just our gut health, but our immune health, our mental health. So just really thinking about solutions like fiber that can multi-solve potentially. So I just want to thank you so much for your time. In the last few minutes with you, I do want to just touch on red flag symptoms that should suggest to you that really this is something you really need to reach out to a healthcare professional, your primary care doc, gastroenterologist, more urgently.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to constipation, first of all, some of the red flag symptoms that I would look at are chronic discomfort, chronic pain, changes in bowel habits, a change in the caliber of the stool. So what I mean by that is rather than having large sausage-shaped bowel movements, we're now starting to see things that are different form, possibly pencil-shaped or something like that, coming out of ribbons. Those would be reasons to consult with your physician. And then there's things that are not directly constipation related, but we need to be aware of. So if you start having black stools without a clear explanation, if your iron counts are low without clear explanation, sometimes it can be confusing. I mean, particularly for women who have a period, that can be complex, but we have to work through that and make sure that we are clear why the low iron levels. If you're having fatigue or if you're losing weight without a clear explanation, I mean, to me, all of these things, I would certainly want to get in with a physician, talk to your primary care doctor first, and then take it from there.
And I'd love to close my time with you with any bite-sized action items that you might have for our listeners. What advice you might give to a patient who's suffering from constipation, something that they could start doing today.
So, of course, increase your fiber intake. This is both dietary fiber from plant-based foods and also fiber supplements. I would encourage increased hydration and increased physical activity, particularly, cardiovascular type exercise where we're like really moving our body. So that's a great place to start. And then, if necessary, complement your fiber with some magnesium. And finally, there was an interesting study, and it gets back to the brain gut connection, the fact that our brain and our gut are inseparable. And they had people doing a breathing exercise. And this is a form of belly breathing. By the way, this has helped with irritable bowel syndrome and people that have food intolerances. You breathe in through your nose for 4 seconds, hold, and then breathe out for 6 seconds through pursed lips. All right, so in through your nose, out through your mouth, a little bit more on the exhale than on the inhale. And by doing this form of actual breathing exercise 5 out of 7 days a week, it was quite fascinating to me because they did nothing else. They did not change their diet. They didn't increase fiber intake or hydration or exercise. They just did this breathing. And they actually improved constipation on a number of different levels. They also improved the sensitivity of their gut, meaning they had less discomfort. So what it brings forward is that there are many ways to improve our bowel motility, our gut function, our ability to digest and enjoy our food, our ability to have a good, healthy bowel movement on a regular basis. There's many ways to do that. And it's not just medication, that there are things like this that can be helpful and beneficial.
I love that. And just to follow up on that study, was there any information about how long people were doing this type of breathing?
So they were doing these breathing exercises for 30 minutes per day. So what they would do is they would do one session, and there's almost a meditative element of sitting there and focusing on your breathing for 30 minutes. So, doing this for 1 or 2 minutes is not going to be adequate in terms of achieving the goal that you have if treatment of constipation is your goal. But it reinforces the idea that the gut and the brain are completely connected to one another, and that things that we do that may help with stress or with mood can actually have the additional beneficial effect on our gut and, in this case, pooping.
Well, I really just want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We've talked to Dr. Will Bulsiewicz about not just constipation, but multi-solving solutions for general health and gut health from fiber. Also, don't forget hydration and physical activity. And more, we're learning about other types of exercises that really show us how much our brain and gut is connected. So thank you so much. To find out more information about Dr. Bulsiewicz, visit theplantfedgut.com or social media at theguthealthmd. Thank you so much for listening. Please take a moment to follow, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. If you'd like to send me an email about topics you're interested in or questions for future guests, please send me a note at webmdpodcast@webmd.net. This is Dr. Neha Pathak for the WebMD Health Discovered podcast.